Hello, and welcome to Introducing Me. I'm your host, Sarah. I started this podcast to get to know other people and lifestyles while discovering more about myself. Each episode, I'll give a new guest a chance to discuss their background, culture, interests, or whatever they want to talk about to help increase all of our own worldviews. Today, I'd like to introduce you to Miguel Yga. He has been traveling for the past 8 years, collecting stories and embracing various indigenous cultures. So he's here to talk about, what he's learned, the things he's experienced, and, how he's sharing out his information. So thank you so much, Miguel, for being here today. Why don't you go ahead and tell the audience more about yourself?
Thanks for having me, Sarah, and hello to everyone around the world. I am Miguel Yga. I am a nomadic writer and adventurer on a mission to collect and share stories that showcase the human experience through travel and storytelling. And like as Sarah mentioned, I've been traveling for the past 8 years, especially among indigenous cultures, with the aim of fostering bridges of connection between different cultures, between different people, getting to know people from cultures that are very different from mine, and having the privilege to share in their stories and be able to share them with the world. As a part of this journey, I've traveled all over North and South America, and I visited all kinds of different cultures, from the Mayans, different Mayan speaking peoples in southern Mexico, Guatemala, Central America. I've spent time with cultures in the US and Canada. And more recently, I've had the opportunity to visit Andean peoples in Colombia and Ecuador, and getting to spend time with them and experiencing some more of their culture, their way of life. And also, I recently published my first book, and I'm very excited about that.
Awesome. Well, we will get into all of that. I want to kind of start at the beginning though. What first kind of made you want to travel, and even just kind of like that first trip, how did you say like I'm going to do this and this is where I'm going?
People always are surprised when I tell them how the story actually started, because because people see now, they see some of my videos on YouTube, or they hear like my crazy stories at a bar or like at a house party, and they go, "Oh, this guy has always just been an adventurer." And when I tell them I was originally a corporate lawyer, their faces fall flatter than when I tell them that I travel with shamans. Because it's like, how? Like, what is this? Like, how did this transition happen? And it kind of starts at the very beginning, like in like the deepest recesses of childhood. Like, I always knew I wanted to be an adventurer. I always knew I was meant to be out in the world, experiencing, having having adventures, traveling. And I just kind of grew up with all these different images from like the adventure novels that I would read, like Treasure Island, or I would read like the weirdest books when I was in elementary school. Things like doomed Arctic expeditions, and I would be like, oh my god, I wish I was on that doomed Arctic expedition, or like people finding sunken treasures, stuff like that. So ever since I started reading, ever since I began reading, I wanted to be a writer. So growing up, I grew up in kind of a stuffy northeastern Mexican conservative society. I originally come from Monterrey, and Monterrey is this industrial business tech city where everybody wants to be an entrepreneur, or a millionaire. It's that kind of a society. It's very much a society where expectations were laid out very clearly for what was a successful person. And a successful person went into business or was a professional, and that's just what everybody did, and that's what you had to do. So I grew up wanting to be a writer. I gobbled up books growing up. Just everything that fell into my hands, I would read it. I would even read like the back of like the toothpaste, the toothpaste pack. I mean, anything I could get my hands on. So, eventually, when it became time to decide what career I wanted to pursue, here in Mexico, it's different from other countries where you might, first dip your toes in, and depending on how you're feeling in a few years of college, you might decide, oh, I want to major in this, I want to major in that. In Mexico, you start studying a profession as soon as you start. So like you don't start based on like skills. You dive headfirst into being a certain profession. So I a lot of people would tell me that I was really good arguing. So I thought, oh well, I might give being a lawyer a chance because it's this profession that kind of goes with my societal expectations. I'm apparently very good at it. And also, I, at the very back of my mind, I always knew I wanted to be a writer. I always knew I wanted to take a crack at it. But the thing was, at 18, when I was deciding what to do, I didn't have like the internal strength or resources that I needed to actually have that courage to pursue my authentic path. But at the very back of my mind, I knew like lawyers have to be very good writers and lawyers have to read a lot. So it just kind of made sense to kind of sneak into writing through the back door. But I studied law and then I went into corporate law. I got my first internships when I was 19. And I just worked all the way through college, immediately jumped into getting my master's degree in corporate law as soon as I graduated. And when I finally had my master's degree in my hands, it was during the graduation ceremony when I was holding this degree and I was looking at it that I realized, oh my God, I just condemned myself to spend the rest of my life in an office. And I panicked. And it was like a fever descended on me. And it really was almost like what a lot of shamans would describe as like a spiritual sickness, where you're living a life that isn't your own and you need to switch paths and you just fall like really, really sick. So I would lie awake, just kind of thinking like, I don't want to be a lawyer anymore. This isn't really what I want to do. I'm not being true to myself. I'm not living the path that I should be living or that I want to, or that I know I want to be living. But what to do, what to do, what to do. And I would just lie awake with all of these images of distant places, exotic locales, like different cultures, different peoples, like peoples I hadn't even met. And I just had it was almost like these lucid dreams of like the whole world just calling me, until eventually that drove me insane enough to quit my job, drop everything I was doing. When I quit my job, I paid off all my debts, and then I was left with $40. And I bought a plane ticket to the Sonoran Desert, where I knew there were all these different indigenous cultures. And I decided to travel among all these indigenous peoples in the Sonoran Desert to experience what life was like in the middle of nowhere, just this like search for everything in the middle of nowhere, and trying to share their stories and live as they do so I could tell others about what that experience was like. So I traveled to Sonora. I mean, if some of your listeners don't know, Sonora is one of the most dangerous states in all of Mexico. It's a place famous for, you know, it's 120-degree heat, drug dealers, it's the narco routes. It's one of Mexico's most dangerous states. And I spent my $40 in 2 days at the beach, and for a month and a half, I traveled on less than $1, and I visited 4 different indigenous peoples. I stayed with Yaqui witches. I met famous singers. I went pearl diving with Mayo divers in the Sea of Cortez. And I hitchhiked over 2,000 kilometers all around that state and staying with all these different indigenous peoples and getting to know and experience how life was in their shoes. Everything from the poverty that they lived in to the beauty of their culture, their deeply connected and spiritual worldviews, and just the color of who they are as a people. And I was hooked on travel. And from there, it has kind of been 8 years passes by in the blink of an eye. And it kind of has been a whirlwind of all these crazy adventures and all these different experiences that I never thought I would have when I first booked that plane ticket and started this journey. Now culminating in my first book about indigenous peoples and some of the things that they had to live through. And it's it's been quite a journey.
It definitely sounds like it's been a bit of a journey. To hear how you started with $40, after quitting your job and paying off all your debts, and then, living off of a dollar for a while. How, in 8 years have you manage to kind of like pay for necessities and make sure, like you have a place to sleep and things like that? I think one of the things that might hold people back from dropping everything and traveling is the realities of, if I run out of my savings, how can I just even survive?
It's very curious because even when I have had the funds to, well, actually pay fully for my travels, I always end up fighting and connecting with people who just want to take me in, want to show me around. Like when you travel, as I do, I consider myself to be an adventure traveler. So adventure travel is all about traveling among locals. It's more than getting like an Airbnb or a hotel. It's about maybe staying with people and like experiencing, life in their shoes, experiencing their culture, living as a local. So I was very lucky because when I quit my job, I landed a couple of law clients that permitted me to do remote work for them. So this was way before, like, the pandemic, way before. This is way before digital nomadism was like that big of a thing. It was actually very frowned upon. I would do contracts or contract work or do like all these legal documents out of like villages in like the mountains or jungles. Often, sometimes I even had to like pass documents to my phone, stand on top of the hut, and like wave my phone around, just trying to get the email to go out, like for through the the cellular data. So I was very lucky in that regard to have found some clients who were willing to overlook that the fact that I was traveling, as long as I did legal work for them, as some freelance legal work. But mostly it has been just trying to connect with people and finding people who are open to sharing their life, their culture, their ways, and having the privilege to stay with them and experience life in their shoes. Some Oftentimes this involves couch surfing, like through the actual couch surfing community. It involves hitchhiking. It involves being open and talking to people, just kind of mentioning what I do. And these opportunities pop up. Sometimes it means volunteering. So there are all these different, let's call it unconventional ways of traveling the world and seeing the world without actually breaking your bank. And I was very lucky to have been as dumb as I was when I started traveling with $1, because it kind of took the fear away from like, oh, I need to have all these savings to go here and like do all these things. I discovered like, no, I mean, money makes things easy, makes things a little more streamlined. But in the end, if you have skills, you can volunteer or exchange them for for accommodation, for tours. It's all about staying open to the possibilities and just and trying to find your way. It involves a lot of trust and letting yourself go, abandoning yourself to the whims of the universe, the whims of the road. And in all the time I've spent traveling, I have never not had a roof over my head except once, and I did it voluntarily because I wanted to camp out in the woods. It was doing a hitchhiking trip from Calgary to Vancouver. It took me 2 days to hitchhike all the way out there. And but otherwise, it'll surprise people how much people are generous in other parts of the world. Like, not everything is as the media tells us. There's a lot of good in the world. There's a lot of really good people, and I've had the really good fortune of bumping into so many of them on the road and getting to live these experiences through their eyes. It's not the same to visit a certain place as a tourist than to visit it as a local. You even feel like you have like insider information, or you're like a part of that world, as opposed to just passing through. This happened to me when I was living in the Lacandon jungle in Mexico. I spent an entire moon's length. I say an entire moon's length because it was around like 20, 28, 29 days in Mexico's most remote jungle. This is the jungle that borders Mexico and Guatemala. So right now it's where a lot of like the migrants cross through. It's that it's that border. But I managed to find a family that was willing to take me in among the Lacandon people, who are some of Mexico's most reserved indigenous peoples. And I had the privilege of spending a month living among them, teaching their kids English, and actually even taught them how to read, because they didn't know how to read. And I exchanged my stay. Well, it wasn't really exchanging so much as giving back by just sharing what I knew, sharing what I could do, and they in turn took me in and took me around the jungle. We rafted down these like remote rivers in the jungle, went on treks into the rainforest. I got to hang out with monkeys and learn Maya, or learn little bits of Maya, which I have picked up and pieced together over my travels, and just really got to know this very unique lifestyle, just by being open and searching for an inn and talking to people. Hey, who do you know who could be interested in taking me in for like a project like this? Or like, who do you know is like open to sharing some of their culture? So money eventually becomes secondary. Mostly, I would say that mostly it plays a big influence when you're going to a more remote place, like getting a plane ticket. Like, it's very hard to hitchhike on a plane, right? But other than that, I mean, it it really is about staying open to the possibilities and just seeing where the road takes you. And it always takes you somewhere amazing, somewhere nice.
Right. Yes. And I think living with the locals as you talk about it and experiencing those cultures, it really, you know, it's the foundation of your travel, living with locals. So I guess my question would be that, like, right now, do you have a home base?
So the last time I had a real home base was literally when I started traveling 8 years ago. So back in my mid 20s. It has been quite a while since I've decorated a room. I mean, I always end up coming back to my hometown to see my parents, to see my family, my give my grandma a hug. Mexicans don't really move around too much. It's a difference. It's a cultural difference from like people in the U.S. who, people in the U.S. will move around from one state to the other, like for jobs, and like it's very common to be somewhere and meet people from all over the U.S. who are just constantly moving around. Like in Mexico, that's not really how things are done, at least traditionally. You are born somewhere, and you usually will also like die there too. So like we have very very deep roots, and my family has always been from here. So all of my family, all of my friends are here. So it has been very convenient because I just need to come back to this one place and just reconnect with friends, family, home, everything I have known, and then just step right back into the unknown and go back home, really, because home for me, being on the road feels like home for me. Like what feels strange to me is staying too long in any given place. And, like I will get, like my feet will literally get itchy. I will wanna just like go somewhere else. Like I'll start all these like things will start piling up. Like I'll start feeling anxious or antsy, and I'll wanna like get on the move again. Like I think, I mean, now that I've had like the benefit of like all these years to like think about it, or like what is it that drives like that need inside me? It's I think it's that I really find myself in movement, in fluidity, in in flowing, and that's kind of what travel is. It's the hallmark of flow. I mean, you go from one moment to the other, one adventure to the next, one place to another, meet one person, meet another person, and it's the adventure of the moment. So I think that's why I find myself centered when I'm on the road, and so off kilter when I'm not. But yeah, it's been a while. Sometimes you do miss it. Sometimes you do want, to buy a TV, or put up pictures on the walls and like get to do those kind of things. But it doesn't. Not a lot of time has to pass before you want to give it up again and head back out. At least that's how it is for me. It's just been so long of like living like this. I can't fathom living anywhere any way else.
Right. Well, so I have two questions from what you just shared. One, which is because your own culture is very much stay in one place, how did your family kind of react to you being like, I'm getting out of here, I'm going to start adventuring? And the other question touches on that last bit, which is, kind of personal artifacts. How much are you actually traveling around with?
Thanks. These are really interesting questions, Sarah. These are really good questions. Um, so when I first told my family that I had bought a plane ticket to go to Mexico's most dangerous state, and I wanted to travel among in like the indigenous cultures there and have adventures and like all these things, they literally sent me to the psychiatrist. They literally sent me to like a Harvard trained psychiatrist. They're like, we're worried about you. We like it, this has to be some kind of mental breakdown or nervous collapse that you're having, because that's the only thing that it could be, right? Like in that worldview, like that's the only thing that would motivate someone to head out on the road and travel and like want to see the world. That's kind of how oh, like my society, or the society that I grew up in, is. So they didn't really react too kindly to it, and for the longest time also, like I wouldn't really open up about the stories, what would happen on the road, like all these different things that I would experience and live. Partly because I didn't want to share, because I still had clients here in my home in my hometown, and I didn't want to complicate that relationship or put unnecessary noise into their heads if they were funding the travels without knowing that they were funding the travels. And also, I mean, sometimes the road can be dangerous, and especially when when you're traveling off the beaten path in these remote places among these isolated peoples and forgotten corners of the world. And it wasn't until fairly recently, I just started a YouTube channel a little less than a year ago, and it hasn't been until fairly recently that I started sharing like my adventures with the brother, like with basically everyone, including and especially with my family. Actually, when my mom first heard the stories of traveling in some of these remote places, she cried. Because I was sharing stories of like near death machete motorcycle accidents in the jungle, nearly getting eaten by sharks, or like having guns pulled on me in like remote places in places where people would pull guns on you, or foiling kidnapping attempts in Guatemala, and like just all these crazy stories, which are I mean, these things are more the minority. It's mostly when you're on the road, at least for me, there's stories of connection, and there's stories of beauty and wonder and color and life, with the occasional like really good bar story that you get out of it too, especially when you're like in some of these more complicated communities. In a lot of the travel that I do happens in the third world, and in places like jungles where that are known to harbor guerrilla groups, or in like places in the high desert on like narco trafficking routes, or like there are wild animals. People do things. People are not as safety conscious in some of these places as we are in, let's say, like the Western world, the first world. So you just kind of have to like learn to deal with it, and you have to learn how to handle like those kinds of situations, and just kind of go along with it, and just make sure you come back. And your other question, I'm sorry, Sarah, what was your other question?
About how much you take with you, like your personal artifacts.
Oh, well, as far as personal artifacts go, I travel with a carry-on backpack, just a carry-on backpack, and that's literally what I live out of. Like when I'm going around in like more touristy areas where you're seeing like like all the different backpackers from like Europe or wherever, and you see these like tiny people, these like short kids carrying 60-70 liter backpacks. I go like what are you doing? I just can't fathom carrying more than 40 liter, like a 40 liter backpack. I I It does require a lot of planning, a lot of meticulous planning, and like gearing up well. You just have to know what to take with you that is versatile, and something you can wear in a hot, humid jungle or beach environment, but which you can also layer when you're in like an Andean region and it's raining and it's very, very cold. So just kind of finding that sweet spot where you know what kind of gear you can take and use is essential. It's a skill, and it's something that you just practice the more you travel. Like the first travels I ever did, I took a very large backpack, which got progressively smaller and smaller and smaller. And if I were to go like on actual vacation from my travels, I would probably just travel with like a school backpack and nothing more. And obviously, the complicated part of this is like being a travel content creator and being a writer, being a digital nomad. You have to carry cameras, you have to carry your laptop, and all these things. And that that can sometimes be a challenge, but it also traveling with a carry-on makes it very easy because you know exactly where everything is at all times. You don't have to think about like, oh, these different backpacks are, this one's here, that one's there, this one has the computer, that one has this. It's all on you. It's all on you. It's relatively lightweight because you're limiting yourself to the capacity of a small backpack. And it just gives you so much freedom. Like I don't have to go anywhere and get my luggage and go anywhere else. If somebody, as happens a lot, like this is related to like the other question you were asking about, how do you say, like, how do you fund with your travels, and how do you stay with these different peoples? Sometimes these opportunities just come out like on the fly, and you have to react and say yes or no in a certain moment. So having the backpack on you and just being like, oh yeah, let's go. I mean, if you have like a good feeling from the person, that just gives you so much freedom, and it becomes really addicting. It becomes really addicting to know that at any moment you can switch plans. If at any moment you need to, you can adapt, flexible. Like in my kind of life, in this lifestyle, you really need flexibility, and you really need that freedom, because it just allows you to find your way on the road, make use of these like amazing opportunities that you get. Sometimes somebody might offer up some accommodation if you're hitchhiking. Oh, where are you staying? And you just go, oh, I have no idea. I was maybe planning on staying here. Oh, stay with my family and let's have dinner and this. And you just go and do it. So yeah, I mean, I also consider myself to be a minimalist. So even before I started traveling, I just started getting rid of everything I had. The one thing I am not a minimalist with are my books, but that's kind of hard to bring with you on your travels. I've tried, and it can double like how much you're carrying. But thankfully, with e-readers, I mean, you can carry thousands of books in your own pocket. I mean, for someone like me, who as a child used to carry every single book he ever owned, like it's a dream come true to have like all these books inside of your pocket. It's easier now more than ever to have less things. Like really, all you need is maybe a week, 2 weeks at tops worth of clothes, your equipment for working on the road, maybe something of a luxury or two. Like I play the harmonica, so sometimes when I'm waiting to be picked up, I'll be playing the harmonica on the road to catch people's attention. Sometimes they'll like throw coins or something, even though I'm not like asking for money or anything. They just think, oh, that conditioning from like movies or something, where oh, somebody's like waiting around and playing a harmonica, let's just give him money. But yeah, a few luxuries and a phone and a whole lot of attitude, and that's basically all you really need.
Right. Well, I appreciate you sharing all of that. I know you've mentioned, your love for reading, your desire to be a writer from such a young age. And now you've published your first book after traveling for the last 8 years. What was that process like in that? Like, when did the book first start and how is the book organized?
So the story starts when I was traveling through Guatemala. I was invited to do a house sit in Guatemala for 3 months for this American lady who had three cats who we called los niños, the children. And so she was going to go back to the US for a while, and she was going to travel around, and she needed somebody to stay with the cats. And I was the happy volunteer. So I got to stay in Antigua, Guatemala for 3 months. And at the same time, some some other American friends were in contact with these women in Guatemala who had survived, these Mayan women who had survived the Guatemalan Civil War in the 80s. So my book is called The Embrace of Silence, a story of hope and healing during the Guatemalan Civil War. And it's the story of these two Mayan sisters who survived the Mayan genocide in Guatemala in the 1980s, and their story of healing the wounds of the war and finding wholeness and just basically healing the unhealable. So it just kind of fits perfectly with it fit perfectly with what I was doing, which was sharing these stories of indigenous cultures and their history and what they had gone through. I was on the road, I was traveling, so I for those 3 months I stayed in Antigua, and I would go out to their village every 2 or 3 days, and we would hold these hours and hours and hours of interviews where I would listen to their story, listen to how it was growing up in rural Guatemala during the 1980s, at the height of the country's brutal civil war. The Guatemalan Civil War lasted for 36 years. It was everything they could remember. It was everything their parents could remember. It was everything their grandparents could remember. So so as so I just found this rhythm living there where I would go see them, and I would record these hours long interviews where they would pour their hearts out, tell me about how their their father disappeared one day. The army came and they didn't see their father again. How they had to survive in rural Guatemala during the war with their mother living in a single parent household. And then how their mother got kidnapped by the army. And then they were orphans, and how they had to survive they found refuge in the arms of the church, and they had to grow up isolated from their culture, like not some of them not knowing who they were because all the brothers and sisters got separated during the war. So growing up as an indigenous person in a largely mestizo or like non-indigenous society, isolated from your culture, isolated from like the natural world where you grew up in, isolated from your family, from everything that made you you, and dealing with these deep scars that just haunt you for the rest of your life. And it's it it was a very moving experience to listen to their stories and cry with them, as they're telling me, like retelling the moments when they realize, oh god, like the army just took our mother, like, or we're alone, or how all the different tribulations that they went through as orphans. And it was a very hard project to write because I am so deeply connected in Guatemala. I mean, something I haven't like shared, within this podcast, is that before before I had before I did that, I had already been to Guatemala, and I had traveled with Mayan shamans. I had stayed with Mayan shamans in Guatemala twice already. So I already had connections, and the Guatemalan people are some of the friendliest people you will know anywhere, and especially Mayans. Mayans are like such a beautiful, quirky, open people. They're just really amazing, and just getting having that background, not having played with Mayan children, and gotten basically adopted into this Mayan family, knowing their spirituality and how deep it runs, and then just hearing like the devastating stories of like the horrors that they had to live during the Civil War was this very hard experience because, at least for me, it was like living it. It was like I was living it for myself because I knew these people so intimately. So, so Guatemala has always been one of my favorite countries to visit because it's so near to Mexico, but it's so different too. It's just such a different country. It's so flavorful, even though it's a small country. The people are amazing, and it has the beauty of the Mayan culture, and of course, having being connected with these different Mayan shamans in Guatemala has also, you know, provided an excuse to keep going back and back for more, learning more, connecting more, like getting invited. Oh, we're gonna go have these ceremonies in around Guatemala. Why don't you come with us and bear witness to it, become a part of it? So so the book goes into so those travels made the book that I wrote that much richer because I experienced the country for myself. I knew that I got to know the people very intimately, and depending on who you ask, even might have become a Mayan shaman. It's a matter of debate. I say that as a joke. I'm not really a Mayan shaman, but I did kind of become one when I was traveling with them by accident. So just kind of having like all that background really helped me write the book that I did, and fill it with so much detail, to fill it with the vibrancy and the color that I was actually seeing in real life, and also the devastation of having these this war, like knowing what a war would do such a vibrant culture like that. And the process of writing it was very interesting. I As a writer, like it was almost like this very idealized version of my life where I call it like the Hemingway lifestyle, where like I would be doing interviews with like Civil War survivors, and then I would go to a bar and write a great part of the book. I would get a happy hour, and then I would go salsa for the rest of the night, like when the workday was done, and then like walk back. So it just kind of became this little routine where I woke up, fed the cats, went out, did the interviews, went to the bar, wrote down everything I had learned, and just started structuring the book for when I wouldn't be in Guatemala. Then switch the computer off, turn around, talk to people, salsa dancing, rinse and repeat. So it was a really cool experience. Really, like thinking back on it was just kind of like this. Everything I imagined being a travel writer would be. And it's just one of many different books that I'm writing. It was the first one to come out because I thought that it was very important that this story be shared, because these are things that are happening in the world and nobody knows about it. Like this isn't just something that happened in the 80s. This is something these are stories of suffering and hardship and oppression that these indigenous peoples go through even to this day. So sometimes by sharing the smallest stories, those of individuals, those of children, I think that we can tell the biggest stories that really touch who we are at our human core, things that we can all relate to, things that can be universally understood and connected with. And that's what I try to do through this book. But my next books are part of a series on called Parallel Worlds, and these are my actual travelogues among these different indigenous peoples. So this other one was more this like war journalism book that I wrote at the same time that I was also writing these travelogues of the actual experiences of staying with these different communities and just sharing that experience, these vicarious experiences with people from all over the world.
Yes, it sounds like sharing their story as definitely, something that was fulfilling and good to get out there to while also be working on, eventually sharing your own stories and all about all these cultures that you've been learning about. Now, I know there's more that I could ask you about, but as we traverse through the internet connections of Wi Fi in Mexico, I want to make sure that I give you time here at the end to share anything else you would like to share before we start to wrap things up.
If you guys want to hear some more of my stories and even follow me on some of my latest vlogs and actual experiences on the road that I've recently been putting up, I started, like I mentioned, I started my YouTube channel. It's called Rambling and Roving with Miguel Yga. You can find it on YouTube. You can find me under my handle Rambling and Roving all over the internet and on every major platform. If you guys want to follow me on my different adventures, even maybe drop in and say hi. I love sharing beautiful parts of the world and getting people to embark on adventures of their own so that they can experience all the beauty that the world has to offer for themselves.
Awesome. Well, I love your handle, Rambling and Roving. I feel like kind of embodies everything you've got going on and like the way you're living your life. So, of course, I'll make sure to leave some of those links in the description. Now, at the end of all my episodes, I do ask my guests a random question. So, my question for you is, what advice would you give your past self?
Don't be afraid. It'll be okay. It'll all work out. Have the courage to go take that first step and see where the road will lead you. Maybe if I had heard it a long time before, who knows what other adventures and stories I could be sharing? What other stories of connection and beauty I would have lived. So I guess that if it's like most travelers, the one regret is that I didn't start sooner. And for all of you who are harboring a dream, you're harboring an adventure, a trip of a lifetime, just take the leap. That's what life is about. Just take a gamble, and play with the deck of cards that you got, and enjoy the road. Just enjoy the adventure of your life.
All right, that brings this episode to a close. So, as Miguel, before he gave that great advice to his past self and to get the listeners out here, he mentioned some of his social media. So, I'll be leaving his website in the description, which of course brings you everywhere. But I'll also be leaving his YouTube link and the link to his book on Amazon if you'd like to go check all of that out. Those will be directly in the description. Of course, if you'd like to connect with the podcast, our website is in the description. It brings you to all of our social media. We are on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. If you would like to support the podcast monetarily, there is a link to do that as well. And if you would like to be a guest on the show and share your stories and culture, my email is in the description. That is always the best way to reach me. So thank you so much, Miguel, for spending time with me today, and to my listeners for taking the time out of your day to hear your new story. Until next time, bye.
Thank you, Sarah. Until next time, keep on rambling and roving. Adios.